My fiancé's family threw me a surprise party, but it was actually an intervention to break us up, so I married him the next day. Julian told me his family was throwing us an engagement party Saturday night at their estate. I didn't trust it. His mother, Patricia, had spent 6 months making it clear I wasn't good enough, asking about my state school education and my parents' working-class jobs with fake sympathy that felt like knives. His sister, Diane, kept seating me next to her accomplished single friends at dinners, loudly comparing our salaries. But Julian looked hopeful when he told me about the party, like maybe his family was finally accepting me, so I said yes. He went early to help set up and sent a car for me. When I arrived at their mansion in Greenwich, he met me at the door looking sick, palms sweating, eyes avoiding mine. I knew immediately something was wrong. We walked into the ballroom and 50 people in expensive clothes turned to stare. A projection screen stood at the front. Victoria was there, Julian's ex-girlfriend from the right family with the right background, standing next to Patricia with a sympathetic smile that made my blood freeze. Patricia stepped forward and announced this wasn't a party, but an intervention to protect Julian from a harmful decision, meaning me. She clicked a remote and the screen lit up with my name and photo. Said they'd hired a private investigator for a background check. Next slide showed my student loan balance. $42,000 in red numbers like a criminal record. She said I'd hidden this debt from Julian even though we'd discussed my loans on our third date. But truth didn't matter here. Next slide showed my credit card statements with charges highlighted, coffee purchases and Netflix subscription presented as evidence of financial irresponsibility. Photos of my studio apartment appeared with captions calling it substandard living. They'd been inside my home taking pictures to use against me. Diane took over explaining they'd researched my family, showing my father's bankruptcy from medical bills when my mother had cancer 8 years ago. Presented it like genetic failure instead of healthcare costs destroying working families. More slides showed my teacher's salary compared to Julian's trust fund, my education versus his Ivy League degree. Victoria spoke in a gentle voice saying she and Julian remained close friends and everyone here acted out of love, that if I really cared about him, I'd want him unburdened by my financial problems. Patricia clicked to a new slide showing a contract. They were offering me $200,000 to end the engagement and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Called it fair compensation for my time. The offer was good immediately if I signed tonight. Otherwise, they'd take aggressive measures. Julian started yelling at his mother, asking if she'd lost her mind. She said calmly this was an intervention because they loved him and someone had to protect him from poor judgment. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Patricia demanded I stop. I kept filming and asked her to repeat the part about the $200,000 payoff. Asked her to explain on camera how she hired investigators to break into my apartment and photograph my belongings. Diane moved toward me and I backed away saying, "Don't touch me." Julian positioned himself between us and told his family they were insane, that he'd known about my loans from the beginning, that we'd discussed finances like adults. His father, Richard, walked in looking confused. He'd been working in his study and had no idea what was happening. Richard saw the contract on screen and asked what the hell this was. Julian gave him a 30-second summary, and Richard's face went from confused to furious. He asked Patricia if she'd really hired private investigators to spy on their son's fiancé. She started to explain, and he told her she'd lost her mind. The room went silent. 50 people had come expecting to watch a gold digger get exposed, but were watching a family destroy itself instead. I saved the video to cloud storage and texted it to my friend telling her to back it up everywhere. Julian grabbed my hand and we walked out. Patricia called after us saying we'd regret this, but Julian kept walking. We got in the car and he told the driver to just drive. 10 minutes of silence, then Julian started crying, apologizing over and over. He had no idea they'd planned this, thought it was really a party. I held him and felt rage burning through the shock. These people had tried to buy me off like I was nothing. I told the driver to take us to the nearest courthouse. Julian looked at me confused and I said, "We're getting married tonight, right now. We're not giving them 3 more weeks to interfere with our lives." Julian said the courthouse would be closed. I Googled 24-hour wedding chapels and found one in Massachusetts. Told the driver the address. Julian asked if I was serious and I said I'd never been more serious. His family just showed exactly who they were, and I wanted them to know they lost. He kissed me, and we drove 2 hours north. The chapel was closed. Massachusetts had a 3-day waiting period after getting a license. The woman there said Rhode Island had no waiting period and was 40 minutes away. We drove to Providence and got to the courthouse at 11:45. A clerk processed our marriage license while we filled out paperwork with shaking hands. She asked if we had witnesses. We needed 2. A young couple came in behind us, girl in a prom dress, also there for a late-night license. Julian asked if they needed witnesses too. They did. We agreed to witness each other's ceremonies. The officiant met us at a riverside park at 1 in the morning. 70 years old in pajamas and a cardigan. He married the other couple first under streetlights, then us. Julian had his grandmother's wedding band in his pocket, been carrying it for weeks. It was too big, but I wore it. I gave him my engagement ring, and it fit his finger perfectly. We said vows about choosing each other when it cost everything, and the other couple cheered when we kissed. We signed our marriage certificate at 1:30 in the morning using the officiant's car hood as a table. Ashley and Derek, our witness couple, took photos with us, and we exchanged numbers. Then everyone left, and Julian and I stood alone in that park legally married. We found a hotel and collapsed fully clothed on the bed. Julian's phone rang constantly, his mother and sister and father calling over and over. He turned it off. I opened my phone and watched the video I'd recorded. Patricia offering money for me to disappear. Diane presenting my father's bankruptcy as evidence against me. Victoria playing the concerned friend. The audio was crystal clear, the visuals damning. I thought about keeping it private for maybe 5 seconds. Then I thought about those 50 people who'd watched them try to humiliate me. About the next working-class girl they'd target. I edited the video adding text, explaining I'd been told this was an engagement party, that everything they presented as scandal was either normal reality for teachers or information Julian already knew, that the payoff was hush money to protect their reputation. I uploaded it to every platform and tagged the Ashworth Foundation's public accounts, added hashtags about class discrimination and family abuse, posted our marriage certificate next to it with a caption saying we got married 6 hours after his family tried to pay me to leave. Then I turned off my phone and went to sleep. By morning, the video had 50,000 views. By noon, it was on local news. A reporter called wanting the full story, and I gave an interview that aired that evening. Comments flooded in from teachers sharing their loan balances, from families bankrupted by medical debt, from everyone who'd been told they weren't good enough because of their income. The Ashworth Foundation's social media filled with people demanding accountability. Patricia's society friends started posting that they'd been misled about the event's nature. Diane's country club membership was questioned. The foundation lost 3 major donors in a week. The video hit 500,000 views by the second day. National outlets picked it up. Morning shows wanted interviews. I said yes to everything. Sat on television in my Target dress and talked about what it felt like to have your student loans presented as a character flaw in front of 50 strangers. Talked about families bankrupted by medical debt being treated like moral failures. Talked about the reality of teaching in America, where we made poverty wages and spent our own money on supplies, while wealthy families looked down on us. The interviewer asked if I regretted going public, and I said absolutely not. That Patricia Ashworth had tried to humiliate me into silence, and instead taught me that some battles are worth fighting publicly. Teachers across the country started sharing the video with their own stories. A hashtag started trending about education debt and class discrimination. The backlash against Patricia intensified. Her charity board asked her to resign. Her friends stopped returning calls. Diane's husband reportedly asked if the negative publicity would affect his business. Victoria's law firm received hundreds of complaints about her participation in the intervention. Richard called Julian saying he needed to see us, that he'd filed for legal separation from Patricia and wanted to apologize in person. We met him at a coffee shop an hour outside Greenwich. He looked destroyed, 10 years older than the last time we'd seen him. Said he'd watched the video 20 times and each viewing made him sicker. That Patricia had told him she was planning a small engagement party and he'd believed her. He'd been in his study working when the whole thing happened and came out to find his family imploding. He asked what he could do to make this right. Julian said he could start by actually holding Patricia accountable instead of enabling her for 30 years. Richard nodded slowly and said that's exactly what he was doing. The separation was the first step. He was meeting with lawyers about divorce. He'd removed Patricia from all foundation positions and family accounts. He was done protecting her from consequences. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote us $50,000 as a wedding gift. Said it came with no strings, no expectations, just his apology. We took the check because refusing it felt performative. Julian's relationship with his father wasn't Patricia's to destroy. We opened a joint bank account the next day and deposited Richard's check along with money from the GoFundMe strangers had started. People had donated $60,000 without us asking. Teachers sending $20 with messages of solidarity. People who'd escaped controlling families sending $50 with notes saying we'd inspired them. Someone whose parents went bankrupt from medical bills sent $500 saying they understood. We paid off my $42,000 in student loans in one transaction. I sat at our laptop and watched the balance go to zero and cried. 28 years old and debt-free because Julian's family tried to destroy me and accidentally showed the world who they really were. We put the rest in savings. Started looking at apartments we could afford together. Julian quit his job at his family's investment firm and started applying to nonprofits. Said he was done building wealth for people who thought money made them better than everyone else. I didn't. My school principal called me into her office Monday morning, and I thought maybe the video had caused problems. Instead, she said the district wanted to honor me at the next board meeting for bringing national attention to teacher financial struggles, that 3 state legislators had reached out asking to meet with me about education funding reform, that the teachers' union wanted me to speak at their annual conference. She asked if I was comfortable with that level of visibility, and I said yes, that if my humiliation could change anything about how we treated teachers in this country, then Patricia's intervention served a purpose she never intended. The board meeting was packed with reporters and cameras. I stood at the podium in the same dress I'd worn to the intervention and talked about teaching 7th grade for $28,000 a year, about spending $3,000 of that on books and supplies, about carrying student loan debt from a state school education that barely qualified me to survive while shaping young minds, about families who looked at that reality and saw unworthiness instead of a broken system. The speech went viral too. Senators started talking about student loan forgiveness and teacher pay increases. The governor mentioned my story in a press conference about education funding. I became accidentally famous for having a terrible, almost mother-in-law, but the platform let me talk about things that actually mattered. Julian found a job at a nonprofit funding arts education in low-income schools, took a 60% pay cut from his investment firm salary, and came home happy for the first time in months. We moved into a small apartment near my school, furnished it with secondhand finds and wedding gifts from people we'd never met who'd seen the video. Built a life that had nothing to do with trust funds or social status or Patricia's approval. His mother tried reaching out through every mutual connection she could find, called Richard begging him to convince Julian to talk to her, sent letters to Julian's office that he returned unopened, had Diane leave voicemails crying about how the family was destroyed. Julian blocked every attempt without hesitation. 6 months after the intervention, Patricia showed up at Julian's nonprofit office. Security called him saying someone named Patricia Ashworth was in the lobby refusing to leave until she saw him. Julian went down and found his mother looking smaller somehow, expensive clothes hanging loose like she'd lost significant weight. She started crying the moment she saw him, said she'd been in therapy twice a week trying to understand why she'd done something so cruel, that she'd lost everything, her charity positions, her friends, her marriage, her children, that she was sorry and needed him to know that. Julian listened without expression, then said he'd think about it and walked away. She apparently sat in that lobby for 3 hours before security finally escorted her out. She tried the same thing at my school 2 days later, waited outside my classroom as students filed out at dismissal. I saw her through the doorway and my stomach dropped, but I kept packing my bag. She asked if we could talk and I said no. She followed me into the hallway saying she needed to apologize, that therapy had helped her see how wrong she'd been. I stopped and turned to face her, asked if she understood what it felt like to walk into a room expecting celebration and finding 50 people watching a presentation about why you weren't good enough. If she understood what it felt like to see photos of your apartment, your private space, displayed on a screen with captions calling you unsuitable. If she understood what it felt like to watch your father's medical bankruptcy presented as evidence of genetic failure. She said quietly that she was beginning to understand. I told her I'd consider her apology when she'd spent as many hours undoing the damage as she'd spent planning that intervention. That when the teachers who saw that video and felt less alone got their student loans forgiven, when families bankrupted by medical debt got relief, when the foundation she'd chaired actually helped working-class people instead of just rich people's tax returns, then maybe we'd talk. Until then, she could live with the consequences of her choices like everyone else had to. She stood there crying while I walked to my car. Julian asked that night if I thought we'd ever forgive her, and I said I didn't know. That forgiveness required her to understand what she'd done, and I wasn't sure she was capable of that level of self-awareness. That she'd spent 60 years believing money and status made her superior, and 6 months of therapy probably hadn't undone that completely. He said that was fair. We decided to handle her attempts at reconciliation as they came, but not to spend our energy worrying about her feelings. She'd made choices, and now she lived with them. We had our own life to build. I spoke at the Teachers Union Conference in front of 2,000 educators, told the story of the intervention and the midnight wedding and the viral video, talked about the shame we'd been taught to feel about student debt and modest salaries, about how Patricia Ashworth accidentally started a national conversation about class and education by trying to humiliate one teacher into leaving her son. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Teachers came up afterward sharing their own stories of being treated as less than because of their income. A woman from rural Alabama said she'd been dating a lawyer whose family looked at her teaching salary like it was a joke. After she saw my video, she'd ended the relationship rather than accept that treatment. Said I'd given her permission to value herself. Another teacher from California said his fiance's family had demanded a prenup protecting their daughter's inheritance from his teacher debt. He'd signed it feeling worthless until my video made him realize the problem was their values, not his career. These conversations happened everywhere I went. The grocery store, the gym, parent-teacher conferences where parents thanked me for standing up for educators. My story had touched something bigger than one family's cruelty. It had exposed how we treated entire professions as worthy of contempt because they didn't generate wealth. Julian's father, Richard, started dating a high school literature teacher named Catherine 6 months after separating from Patricia. He brought her to meet us, and she was kind and real and didn't perform wealth like Patricia did. She taught at a public school in New Haven and loved her students fiercely. Richard asked if we'd consider having dinner with them regularly, and we said yes. He'd proven through his actions that he'd changed, that he was willing to abandon his social circle to date a woman Patricia would have deemed unsuitable. Patricia found out about Catherine and apparently lost her mind. Called Richard, screaming about him replacing her with someone so beneath them. He told her that was exactly the attitude that destroyed their family and hung up. Diane called Julian crying that their mother was having a breakdown. Julian said that wasn't his problem to fix, that Patricia had choices and consequences and he was done protecting her from reality. Diane accused him of being cruel, and he laughed. Said she'd stood there clicking through slides designed to humiliate his fiancé and now wanted to lecture him about cruelty. He hung up and blocked her number too. We spent holidays with my parents and Richard and Catherine, had Thanksgiving in my parents' small house where my dad still drove trucks and my mom still worked retail, and nobody performed wealth or status. Richard fit in surprisingly well. talking to my father about labor unions, and asking my mother about her recovery from cancer. Catherine brought homemade pie and talked to me about classroom management strategies. This was family, people who chose to show up and be kind without requiring performance or submission. Ashley and Derek invited us to their baby's first birthday party. We drove to their apartment in Massachusetts and met their families who were young and working class and welcomed us immediately. Ashley's mother asked about the viral video and said she'd shared it with everyone she knew because her daughter had been treated the same way by Derek's wealthy aunt, that seeing us fight back had helped them set boundaries. Derek's father said he'd been a teacher for 30 years and never made more than $35,000, that he'd felt ashamed of his salary until my story reminded him teaching was noble work that a broken system undervalued. We ate grocery store cake and played with their daughter and felt more connected to these strangers than we'd ever felt at Patricia's estate. The video continued spreading for months. International outlets picked it up. I did interviews with BBC and Australian television. Teachers in other countries reached out saying they faced the same class discrimination. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about doing a feature on education inequality using my story as the entry point. I agreed because the platform could help other teachers. The state legislature passed a bill increasing starting teacher salaries by 15%. 3 senators cited my video during floor debates. The governor signed it at my school with me standing behind him for the photo op. My principal cried during the ceremony, saying she'd been fighting for better teacher pay for 20 years, and it took one viral video to make politicians listen. I told her it wasn't just the video. It was decades of teachers like her doing the work and finally getting noticed. But privately, I knew Patricia's cruelty had accidentally accomplished what years of advocacy couldn't. She'd made the invisible visible, made people who'd never thought about teacher poverty or student debt suddenly understand how broken the system was. My classroom became a pilgrimage site for teachers visiting the area. They'd stop by during planning periods to meet me and take photos, tell me their own stories of financial struggle and family rejection. I kept a notebook of their experiences, thinking maybe someday I'd compile them into something that could help others. Julian's nonprofit expanded its programs. Donors who'd seen the video reached out wanting to fund arts education specifically because they trusted his organization. He hired 3 new staff members and opened programs in 5 additional schools. Came home exhausted but fulfilled in a way his investment firm job never made him. We'd talk over cheap wine and grocery store pasta, about the kids getting art and music classes who'd never had them before, about the teacher I'd met that day who'd been shamed for her salary by her ex's family, about how Patricia's attempt to destroy us had somehow created this strange ripple effect of positive change. 8 months after the intervention, Diane showed up at our apartment. Julian answered the door and found his sister standing there with her daughter. She'd driven 3 hours without calling first. Asked if she could come in. Julian looked at me and I shrugged. We let her in. She sat on our secondhand couch holding her 5-year-old and said she was sorry, that watching the fallout from the intervention had forced her to examine her own behavior, that she'd been raised to value status over character and had never questioned it until her daughter asked why Uncle Julian didn't come to their house anymore. She'd tried to explain and realized she couldn't justify what they'd done in terms a child would understand. If she couldn't explain it to her daughter, then maybe it was indefensible. She'd been in therapy too, working through her own complicity in the family's dysfunction. She wasn't asking for immediate forgiveness, but wanted us to know she understood she'd been wrong, that she was trying to be better. Julian listened without interrupting, then asked if she'd apologized to Patricia or if she was just here because the consequences had become uncomfortable. Diane admitted she hadn't spoken to their mother in months, that Patricia refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and Diane couldn't be around that denial anymore. She'd chosen her daughter over her mother's approval. Julian said that was a start. We didn't commit to anything but exchanged phone numbers. After she left, I asked Julian how he felt and he said confused. That part of him wanted his sister back, but part of him didn't trust this wasn't another manipulation. I said we didn't have to decide anything immediately. We could just see if her actions matched her words over time. A year after the intervention, we renewed our vows. Not because the first ceremony wasn't valid, but because we wanted to celebrate with people who'd supported us. We rented a small garden venue and invited 40 people. My parents, Richard and Catherine, Ashley and Derek with their daughter, colleagues from my school, friends from Julian's nonprofit, teachers I'd met through speaking events. Patricia wasn't invited. Diane was, and she came with her daughter but without her husband, who was apparently still aligned with Patricia. Victoria sent flowers with a card saying she understood why she wasn't welcome, but wanted to wish us happiness. The ceremony was simple. The same vows we'd said in a park at 2 a.m, but this time surrounded by people who loved us. My principal gave a reading about choosing your family. Richard toasted to second chances and proving you can change. Catherine read a poem about love that costs everything and gives everything back. We cut a cake that cost $80 from a local bakery and danced to music from a playlist Julian had spent weeks perfecting. It was perfect because it was ours. That night, Julian told me his mother had sent another letter through Richard, that she'd seen photos of the vow renewal on social media, and it had apparently triggered something. She was asking for a meeting, just the 3 of us with a therapist present. Said she'd spent a year in intensive therapy and had things she needed to say. Julian asked what I thought. I said I'd consider it, but only if we set clear boundaries, that we'd meet once with no promises beyond listening. that if she used the meeting to make excuses or play victim, we'd leave and not try again. Julian relayed the conditions through Richard, and Patricia agreed. We scheduled the meeting for 2 weeks later at a neutral therapist's office. I was terrified driving there. Julian kept asking if I was sure about this, and I kept saying no, but we should try anyway. The therapist met us first and explained she'd been seeing Patricia weekly for months, that Patricia had done significant work, but this meeting was about accountability, not reconciliation, that we could leave at any point if we felt uncomfortable or manipulated. Patricia arrived looking nothing like the woman who'd orchestrated the intervention. She'd lost probably 30 pounds, her expensive clothes replaced with simpler outfits. Her hair was gray where it used to be colored. She looked her age for the first time. She sat across from us, and the therapist asked her to begin. Patricia took a shaking breath and said she was sorry. Not the sorry of someone trying to get what they want, but the sorry of someone who'd looked at themselves and found something ugly. She said she'd spent 62 years believing that money and status determined human worth, that she'd been raised by parents who measured everything by social position and she'd never questioned it, that she'd looked at Julian dating me and seen a threat to the family legacy she'd spent decades building. She'd genuinely believed she was protecting him by trying to pay me off. The therapist asked her to be specific about what she was apologizing for. Patricia listed it out. Hiring investigators to violate my privacy, presenting my father's bankruptcy like a character flaw, displaying my student loans to humiliate me, offering me money like I was something to purchase, creating a public spectacle designed to shame me into leaving. She said she understood now those actions weren't protection, but abuse, that she'd used her power and resources to harm someone who'd done nothing wrong except be born into different circumstances. She said watching the video of her own behavior had been devastating because she'd seen herself clearly for the first time. The cruelty wasn't disguised as concern in the harsh light of recording. It was just cruelty. She'd lost her marriage, her social position, her children, and her self-image in the year since. The therapist asked if she'd do anything differently if she could go back. Patricia said everything. That she'd been given a chance to welcome someone Julian loved, and she'd chosen warfare instead. That the intervention had destroyed her family and she'd done it to herself. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. Just wanted us to know she finally understood the harm she'd caused. The therapist asked if we had questions. I asked why it took losing everything for her to see what she'd done was wrong. Why losing her social position mattered more than basic human decency. Patricia said she'd been insulated from consequences her whole life. That wealth had protected her from ever having to examine her beliefs or behavior. That losing everything had forced her to confront who she actually was without status to hide behind. And she hadn't liked what she'd found. Julian asked if she understood that an apology didn't erase what happened or entitle her to access to our lives. Patricia said yes. That she'd spent a year learning that consequences don't disappear because you're sorry. That she might never have a relationship with him again. And that was her fault, and her loss to bear. The therapist asked what we needed from this meeting. I said acknowledgement that what happened was abuse, not a misunderstanding or difference of opinion. Patricia said clearly it was abuse, that she'd used her power to deliberately harm me, and she owned that completely. Julian asked what she wanted from us. Patricia said nothing, that she'd asked for this meeting because her therapist said taking accountability without expecting anything in return was part of her healing. But our healing didn't require forgiving her or including her in our lives. We sat in silence for a minute. Then I asked if she'd done anything to undo the damage beyond working on herself. She said she'd donated $100,000 to a teacher loan forgiveness program in my name, that she'd resigned from every charity board to make space for people with different perspectives, that she'd been volunteering at a food bank serving families like mine who struggled to make ends meet, that she was trying to use her remaining resources to help people she'd once looked down on. It wasn't enough and never would be, but it was what she could do. Julian asked if she understood we might never want a relationship with her. She said she understood. That this meeting might be the last time she saw him, and she accepted that. The therapist asked if we wanted to schedule another meeting or leave it open. We said we'd think about it. Patricia thanked us for coming and left quickly. Julian and I sat there with the therapist processing what had happened. She said Patricia had done genuine work, but that didn't obligate us to anything. That we got to decide what boundaries felt safe. We drove home in silence. Finally, Julian asked what I was thinking. I said I believed Patricia's apology was real, but I wasn't ready to let her back in our lives. That maybe someday, but not now. He said he felt the same way, that his mother had caused real harm and being sorry didn't undo that. We agreed to table the question of Patricia for at least 6 months and focus on the life we'd built. 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant. We hadn't been trying, but we weren't preventing it either. Julian cried when I told him, happy tears this time. We told my parents first, and they were ecstatic. Told Richard and Catherine, and they toasted with champagne. Told Ashley and Derek, who said their daughter needed a friend. Told the teachers I'd become close with, who threw me a shower at school. The question of telling Patricia came up. Richard asked if we wanted him to let her know, and we said not yet. That we'd decide after the baby was born how to handle it. My pregnancy was easy. I taught up until 2 weeks before my due date. Students brought baby gifts and drew pictures for the nursery. Parents I'd worked with for years brought meals and offered advice. The nonprofit Julian worked for gave him parental leave, which was rare and generous. Our daughter was born in September, small and perfect with Julian's eyes and my stubborn chin. We named her Grace after no one in particular, just because we liked it. The first week home was exhausting and beautiful. My parents visited, and my mother held Grace for hours while my father helped Julian assemble furniture. Richard and Catherine brought groceries and cleaned our kitchen without being asked. Diane texted asking if she could meet her niece, and we said eventually, but not yet. Patricia sent a gift through Richard, an antique silver rattle that had been Julian's. The card said simply, "Congratulations." We put the rattle in Grace's room but didn't respond. 3 months after Grace was born, Patricia asked through Richard if she could meet her granddaughter. Said she understood if the answer was no, but wanted us to know she'd like to know Grace if we ever felt comfortable with that. Julian asked what I thought. I said I'd think about it. We talked to our therapist about it. Yes, we'd started couples therapy after Grace was born to navigate new parenthood and family dynamics. The therapist asked what we were afraid would happen if we let Patricia meet Grace. I said I was afraid she'd look at our modest apartment and our Target baby clothes and our secondhand furniture and judge us. That she'd find some way to make us feel small even while pretending to be reformed. Julian said he was afraid she'd try to use Grace to manipulate her way back into being central to our lives. The therapist asked if those fears were about who Patricia was now or who she'd been before. We admitted we didn't know. She suggested a supervised meeting in a neutral location with clear time limits, that we could test whether Patricia's changes were real without giving her access to our daily lives. We agreed to try. We met Patricia at a park on a Saturday morning. She arrived exactly on time carrying nothing, having apparently learned that showing up with expensive gifts would be unwelcome. She approached slowly and asked if she could see Grace. I held Grace tighter but nodded. Patricia looked at her granddaughter and tears ran down her face. She didn't ask to hold her or take photos or do anything except look. She said she's beautiful and you can see both of you in her face. We walked through the park and talked about nothing important. The weather, the trees changing color, Grace's sleep schedule. Patricia asked about my teaching and listened without commenting on my salary. Asked about Julian's nonprofit and said she'd seen the news about their expansion. After 30 minutes, she said she should probably go, that she didn't want to overstay or push boundaries. She thanked us for letting her meet Grace and walked away without asking for another meeting or trying to hug anyone. Julian and I looked at each other surprised. We'd expected manipulation or overstepping and gotten neither. We went home and talked about it. Agreed that Patricia seemed genuinely different, but that one meeting didn't mean we were ready for more. We told Richard to let Patricia know we appreciated her respecting our boundaries. The next month, Patricia asked if she could meet Grace again. Same parameters, supervised and time limited. We agreed. This meeting was similar. Careful conversation and respect for boundaries. She asked if she could hold Grace this time, and I hesitated but said yes. Patricia held her granddaughter like she was made of glass and cried quietly. Told Grace she was sorry for all the hurt she'd caused and hoped Grace would grow up in the family Julian and I had built, one based on love instead of status. We let her hold Grace for 5 minutes, then I took her back. Patricia didn't argue. Over the next 6 months, we met Patricia once a month. Always supervised, always time limited. She never pushed for more or showed up at our apartment or tried to buy her way back in with expensive gifts. She asked about our lives and listened and offered support only when asked. It was strange seeing this version of his mother, one who'd been humbled by consequences into becoming someone almost likable. Julian's relationship with her thawed incrementally. He started taking her calls occasionally, met her for coffee once without me to talk through some of his anger. Diane became a regular part of our lives. She'd left her husband who refused to acknowledge the family's dysfunction and moved closer to us with her daughter. She and Julian rebuilt their sibling relationship slowly. Her daughter and Grace had playdates. She'd done her own work examining how she'd been complicit in the family's cruelty and was trying to raise her daughter differently, to value character over status and kindness over social position. 2 years after the intervention, Patricia asked if she could host Thanksgiving. Said she wanted to cook for her family in her new apartment. Nothing fancy, just a meal together. We almost said no out of habit, but decided to risk it. Patricia's new place was a modest 2-bedroom with IKEA furniture and none of the pretension of the estate. She'd cooked everything herself, simple dishes without hired help. Richard and Catherine came, Diane and her daughter, my parents who were nervous but willing to try. We ate grocery store rolls and turkey that was slightly dry and pumpkin pie from a box. Patricia thanked everyone for coming and said this was the best Thanksgiving she'd ever had, because it was real. My father talked about his trucking roots and Patricia asked genuine questions instead of barely concealed disdain. My mother showed photos of Grace and Patricia looked at them like they were precious instead of evidence of our modest lifestyle. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. We went home that night and I told Julian I thought his mother might actually have changed. He said he thought so too, but time would tell. Grace is 4 now. We have a second child, a son named Leo, who's 2. We bought a small house near my school with help from Richard, who'd made it clear he wanted to support us without strings. Julian still works at the nonprofit, which has expanded to 12 schools. I still teach 7th grade English and use my platform from the viral video to advocate for education reform. Patricia sees her grandchildren once a month with boundaries we maintain carefully. She volunteers at a nonprofit serving low-income families and has apparently found purpose in helping people she once would have ignored. Diane is one of my closest friends now. having done the work to unlearn the toxic values she was raised with. Her daughter and Grace are inseparable. Richard and Catherine got married last year, and we stood up at their wedding. My parents are healthy and involved grandparents who babysit so Julian and I can have date nights. We still live modestly because that's who we are and we're proud of it. The intervention video still gets shared occasionally when conversations about class discrimination trend online. Teachers still reach out thanking me for validating their struggles. I've written a book about education inequality that comes out next year. Ashley and Derek send Christmas cards with photos of their 3 kids now. The officiant who married us in the park sent a note on our anniversary every year until he passed away last year at 78. His family invited us to his memorial, and we went, grateful for the role he'd played in our story. Sometimes I think about that night in the ballroom, Patricia clicking through slides designed to destroy me, how it felt standing there being dissected in front of 50 strangers, how close I came to just leaving and letting them win, but I stayed, and I recorded it, and I fought back. And that choice changed everything. Not just for us, but for thousands of teachers who needed someone to say out loud that the system was broken. For families drowning in medical debt who needed someone to name it as failure of society, not character. For everyone who'd been told their economic circumstances made them less than. Patricia tried to pay me to disappear, and instead made me visible. Made all of us visible. The people who work hard and struggle anyway. The people who choose meaningful work over wealth. The people who love fiercely across class lines despite families who say it's wrong. We're raising Grace and Leo to understand that worth has nothing to do with money, that kindness matters more than status, that you stand up for people even when it costs you something. They'll grow up knowing their grandmother made terrible choices and did hard work to become better, that people can change, but that doesn't erase harm, that forgiveness is complicated and boundaries are healthy and families are built by choice, not just blood. And they'll know their parents got married at 2 a.m. in a park by a river because sometimes the right choice looks ridiculous, but you do it anyway. Patricia learned that lesson the night we drove away from her intervention and toward a life she couldn't control. She just needed to lose everything to understand it. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.